Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending our webinar today from Green Energy Consumers Alliance. And the topic for today is how you, as a Rhode Island citizen, can take action on Rhode Island's 2022 Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Plan. We need to reduce emissions in Rhode Island, and it all starts with a plan. First, some webinar logistics. You're all muted to avoid background noise. However, we do want to take questions at the end of the presentation. And there's a box for questions in the GoToWebinar screen where you can type them in. We'll answer them at the end. The presentation is being recorded, and at the end of the event, we will pull the recording together and also a PDF of the slides, and we'll send those out to you by email to those of you who are here, as well as a number of people registered who haven't made it, but we'll get that out within a couple of days. So my name is Larry Cretion. I'm the Executive Director of Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and our mission as a nonprofit organization is to harness our power as energy consumers to speed the transition to a zero carbon future. And we do that through a mix of things, programs, and advocacy. With me today, we've got two great staff, Amanda Barker, who is our policy associate for the state of Rhode Island, and Anna Vanderspeck, who's our electric vehicle program director, who is an expert on transportation policy. Amanda will focus on electricity and building decarbonization, and I'll help out where I can. Next slide. So here's an outline for today. We are going to give you the background on what we're talking about, the fact that the state of Rhode Island is putting together a plan to reduce emissions in order to comply with the 2021 Act on Climate, which says that by 2030, 45%, we have to see in Rhode Island a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And we will break it down into what we see as the three big sectors when we talk about greenhouse gases. The electricity sector, which is actually has been doing the best over the last few years, but it has room for improvement. And we'll highlight some of the great things there. The transportation sector, which is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions in Rhode Island. Anna will talk about that. The thermal sector, that's essentially keeping us warm in our homes and businesses, and that will be also presented by Amanda. We'll do electricity and thermal. And then at the end, we'll talk about how you all can take action. We have written a blog about this plan that the state of Rhode Island is doing, where we sort of laid out what we saw in the plan and where we think it could be improved. And you can find that by going to our website, greenenergyconsumers.org/blog. So to give you a sense of the challenge here, back in 2014, the state of Rhode Island passed the Resilient Rhode Island Act, which set an aspirational goal to reduce emissions over time to get to, they essentially wanted to reduce emissions by about 75% by 2050. Honestly, we weren't thrilled with that particular act because it was not a mandatory target. The other states like Massachusetts and California and New York had set such mandatory targets, but we were, so we kept working with allied groups like the Conservation Law Foundation and many others. And we were thrilled in 2021 that the legislature passed and the governor signed the Act on Climate. And this is a mandatory target. This means that we can hold the state accountable for setting the policies necessary to reduce emissions. And as you can see, this is essentially comparing emissions to 2020, and we need to reduce them quite a bit, 45% by 2030. Got to keep going, get it down to more than 75% reduction by 2040, and net zero by 2050. So it's a pretty steep slope, but it's consistent with Massachusetts and Rhode Island, Massachusetts, California, New York, Oregon, Washington. So the Act on Climate is not self-executing. It does not by itself make the things happen that are going to reduce emissions in the sectors. There need to be follow-on policies, and that's what we're here to talk about, the plans that need to be implemented. Some might require legislative activity, and some might just simply require the governor's office to do as the head of the executive branch. And we'll get into those today. Next slide. So here's the story, which is according to the Act on Climate, the state of Rhode Island requires the Energy Climate Coordinating Council to update their 2016 greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan. And in particular, they have to make sure that it jives with the Act on Climate mandates. It covers a lot of ground, a lot of aspects of the society because it is an economy-wide situation, but we're going to focus on the big three sectors when it comes to emissions: electricity, transportation, and thermal. Next slide. I'll just say that before we get into the sector by sector analysis that Amanda and Anna will do for us, we just wanted to highlight three things that we saw that are sort of overarching or cross-cutting. The first is we encourage the state of Rhode Island to publish how much each sector or even subsector will be responsible for in terms of emission reductions. For example, we know it's 45% statewide by 2030, but how much exactly from the electricity sector? And it's how much exactly from transportation, and in particular in transportation, are we going to get the reductions from automobiles or trucks or public transit? How much could we possibly get from encouraging walking and biking? In the building sector, how much from the residential sector? How much from the commercial and industrial sector? How much for space heat emissions reductions? How much from reducing emissions that are associated with heating water? We'd like to see that level of detail. Massachusetts ostensibly does that. It's quite frankly, it's not perfect, but it gives us better insight and that enables us to be able to make more specific comments back to state government there. So we'd like the final report from EC4 to get into that level of sector detail. Secondly, what's important, what's a game changer is that the state of Rhode Island needs to prepare itself to take full advantage of the new Federal Inflation Reduction Act. So we want the plan to lean into that, to be more aggressive, because there's going to be a whole lot of federal resources, grants and loans coming from the federal government that can touch every home, every business, every city or town, and the entire state of Rhode Island. And then thirdly, there are appliance standard upgrades that can be made from time to time, and that can touch on something that might save electricity, oil, or gas, and we can take advantage of those opportunities. Again, it goes across the sectors. We didn't see a lot of that referenced in the draft plan that we saw. So I'd like to get more into that as we go. Next slide. And now I'll turn it over to Amanda, who's going to talk about the electricity sector.
All right. I don't believe I can advance the slides yet.
You should be able to, Amanda. Try again.
It's not working for me. Should I just say next slide?
Yep, we'll do that.
All right. All right, next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to dive into EC4's priority actions within the electric sector. Overall, we were pretty happy with their priority actions. The electric sector is definitely the strongest sector in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but as with anything, there's always room for improvement. So their first priority action was to implement the 100% renewable energy standard by 2033. which is a huge step. This will eliminate emissions from the electric sector, which currently make up about 26% of economy-wide emissions in Rhode Island. Their next priority action is going to be to modernize the electric grid, and this will better help integrate distributed generation resources such as wind and solar, which is also super important. And then they also listed deploying advanced metering as a priority action. And this will enable time-varying rates and help customers better manage their energy usage. Next slide. All right, and then they also listed procuring offshore wind as a priority action, which we are super excited about. We think that offshore wind is really the biggest lever that we can pull to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And as you all likely know, we have 400 megawatts coming to Rhode Island from the Revolution Wind Farm, which is expected to come online in 2025. And then Rhode Island Energy also just released an RFP for 600 to 1,000 megawatts of offshore wind. So things are definitely looking promising as far as offshore wind helping us decarbonize and reduce emissions in the electric sector. And then their last priority action for the electric sector is to complete the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative Program Review, which is a super important program that caps and reduces CO2 emissions from the power sector. Next slide. So now moving into our comments on their priority actions. As I said, they were pretty strong and we definitely support their priority actions. But we would also like to see a more strategic plan when it comes to energy storage and demand management. The draft chapters didn't go into too much detail about either. So we just wanted to emphasize that, we hope they'll continue to develop a plan for such technologies as they're super important for things like improving reliability, reducing the need for polluting peaker plants as backup generation, reducing the risk of curtailment of renewable energy generation. And we know that Rhode Island Energy is releasing a grid modernization plan with the PUC by the end of the year. And that's going to include advanced meters for demand management. So we're excited about that, and we'll definitely be following closely and providing comments to best represent the public interest. Next slide. We also would like to see continued coordination with New England states on transmission. Recently, 5 New England states released an RFI on transmission, including Rhode Island, which we were super excited to see. And we just want to urge that collaboration to continue as we feel that regional transmission is really crucial to integrating renewable energy, not only here in Rhode Island, but across the region. Next slide. We also want to see more support for municipal aggregation. The draft chapters didn't mention municipal aggregation at all, which is when a municipality purchases electricity in bulk from a competitive supplier on behalf of its residents. And the default electricity supply contains more renewable content than required by the Renewable Energy Standard. And that obviously helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions by allowing a cleaner supply of electricity. So we would love to see more support for that. As you can see here on the right, there are currently 6 Rhode Island municipalities that are going to be starting aggregation programs in the spring, and we would like to see that continue to grow. Next slide. Now I'm going to pass it over to Anna to talk about the transportation sector.
Hi, everybody. I'm back to talk about the transportation sector. Thanks, Amanda. So as Larry has already mentioned at the outset of this presentation, transportation is a really important sector because it is the #1 emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in Rhode Island. So this is a graph from climatechangeri.gov, and you can see each sector as a different slice of the pie. And transportation is 36% of Rhode Island's greenhouse gas emissions. It's the largest slice of the pie. As Larry also referred to earlier, we've done a relatively good job over the years of cleaning up our electric sector, thanks to things like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and the Renewable Energy Standard. We still have a lot of work to do on that front, and that's why offshore wind is so exciting. But if we really want to achieve our greenhouse gas emissions reductions requirements, we really have to tackle the transportation sector. I also want to mention here that transportation is responsible for the largest chunk of greenhouse gas emissions, but it also produces all sorts of other emissions that we also want to reduce for public health reasons. So there's a lot of data from folks at the American Lung Association and others about the harm that our reliance on burning fossil fuels in vehicles causes to people's health. Burning fossil fuels releases particulate matter and nitrogen and sulfuric oxides and creates ground level ozone, and all of these things hurt people's lungs, but also hearts and brains. And so getting these emissions down is both a climate and a public health imperative. Transportation as a sector is a particularly difficult nut to crack. So this is a graph from the Department of Environmental Management that shows transportation emissions over time, starting in 2005 and up to 2017, which is unfortunately not particularly recent, but the most recent we could find. So the top two lines are passenger cars and trucks. The middle lines are short haul, long haul, and commercial trucks. And then the bottom two lines are intercity and transit buses. And what you can see on this graph is that for the most part, the lines are relatively flat. There are some decreases in 2010 in passenger trucks and short haul and long haul commercial trucks. That's likely due to the economic crisis that followed 2008. But if we were to extend this graph from 2017 to today, I would definitely expect those lines to have either flattened out or even increased, with a bump for the pandemic for sure, but mostly due to the arrival of online shopping as a sort of everyday occurrence. Vehicle miles traveled are trending up, and this is a big problem in the transportation sector because the more miles we drive, the more we pollute. One other point I'd like to make on this graph is that often when we talk about transportation, people think of the federal efficiency standards. You might have heard of them. They're called the CAFE standards, which require that the fleet of vehicles that manufacturers put out get more efficient over time. And those standards have done a really good job of increasing the average miles per gallon of new vehicles over time. But unfortunately, those efficiency gains have been offset by the fact that over the same time period, Americans are driving larger and larger vehicles and driving longer distances. So those efficiency gains, unfortunately, have not resulted in steep enough emissions reductions that we need in the transportation sector. So looking at that reality, EC4 proposed basically a two-pronged strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. So the first is to work on consuming less fuel, so specifically encouraging modes of travel other than individually owned passenger vehicles, so moving people from their gas cars to walking, biking, public transit, and other forms of shared mobility. And then the second line of attack is to consume less polluting fuel, which really means switching the vehicles that are on the road from fossil fuels to electric vehicles. Within that first category of consuming less fuel, EC4 has several priority actions. One is to grow transit ridership, which is a good thing. A lot of transit agencies across the country have seen transit ridership go down over the years, both as a result of less service and also then the COVID pandemic. So we're glad to see that there's an explicit goal to increase transit ridership. And the main ways that EC4 proposes doing that is to implement the Rhode Island Transit Forward 2040 plan and the Transit Master Plan. EC4 also wants to develop a complete streets state plan to leverage federal funding. So if the term complete streets is new to you, that is a way of thinking about moving people through space that doesn't focus on moving vehicles, but instead focuses on moving people. So if Rhode Island has a state plan on complete streets, it'll be able to leverage federal funds to expand sidewalks or put in bike lanes or do other things that make it easier for people to get from place to place without jumping into an expensive personally owned vehicle. And then finally, EC4 wants to model the climate impacts of transportation demand for capital projects. And this might sound a little wonky, but it's actually really exciting, which means that when Rhode Island is looking at a big new capital project for transportation, it'll have to think about what the greenhouse gas emissions impact of that project will be, so that you can compare projects side by side, not only on cost and how many people they might move, but also on greenhouse gas emissions. So you can start factoring that into state decision making. On the second category of consuming less polluting fuel, EC4 has a bunch more priority actions. The first is to increase EV adoption to 30% by 2027. So by 2027, 30% of new cars should be electric. It identifies the fact that incentive programs will be really important to get the state there, both for electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. So right now, the state of Rhode Island has the DRIVE program, which offers a rebate for the purchase of an electric vehicle. But there used to be other incentive programs available as well. The electric utility that was National Grid had a Make Ready program where they helped build out charging infrastructure. And for a while, the state of Rhode Island had a complementary program called Electrify Rhode Island that would help cover some of the costs of building out particularly public charging infrastructure. So EC4 is identifying programs like that as important to helping the state reach those required emissions reductions. One thing that we're really excited to see in the priority actions is a focus on electrifying public transit. Our staff was in Rhode Island earlier this year to celebrate the new electric buses and the ripped up bus fleet. We want to see more of those, and we're really glad to see EC4 prioritize that. And then finally, one of the priority actions is to maintain existing fuel standards and adopt new ones, which we'll talk about more very shortly. So our comments, like in the electric sector, basically fall into three main buckets. The first is to support EC4's call for the state of Rhode Island to adopt the Advanced Clean Cars 2 standards. So for those of you who have not heard the ACC2 acronym before, these are standards coming out of California that would require manufacturers to increase the percentage of electric vehicles that they sell every year. So in 2026, manufacturers will have to have 35% of the cars that they sell be electric, and that goes up every year until we reach 100% in 2035. We want Rhode Island to adopt these standards because individual states actually can't write their own regulations on vehicle efficiency or emissions. That is something that is left to the federal government, with the exception of California. California is such a big state and had existing regulations when the Clean Air Act passed. So they have the right to write their own standards, and then other states can adopt the standards that California puts out. So this is something that we absolutely think Rhode Island should do by hopping onto what California is doing and the other states that will be adopting those standards. We can really leverage those larger markets, even though Rhode Island is a relatively small state, to put pressure on those manufacturers and make sure that consumers have all the options that people in California and Massachusetts can enjoy. So EC4 identified adopting the Advanced Clean Cars standards and then other similar vehicle standards, like a similar rule about trucks and a rule called the Heavy Duty Omnibus Bill that will clean up diesel trucks that are coming out. We think we should adopt all of those because really this is the single largest step that Rhode Island can take in the transportation sector. And I here want to give a shout out to Senator DeMario and Rep. Courtbrand, who are working on legislation to make sure that Rhode Island really follows through and adopts these standards next year. Our second big comment on the transportation sector is that we want to support EC4 in the call for incentives for lots of different types of electric mobility. So we've been running a program since 2016 called Drive Green that some of you might be familiar with, where we help people make the switch from gas cars to electric vehicles. And so we have seen firsthand how important those incentives are at this beginning stage of the transition. So we're glad to see and support a call for incentives for new and used vehicles, personal vehicles as well as fleet vehicles, light duty vehicles as well as heavy duty vehicles, and cars as well as e-bikes. We really got to electrify everything on our roads, so incentives will get us a fair way there. One addition that we offered to the EC4 is that, as Amanda mentioned earlier, there are different ways of pricing electricity, and one way to do that is to implement time varying rates or time of use pricing, where basically you as the consumer pay a different rate depending on demand for electricity on the electric grid as a whole. And what that means in practice is that usually in places where there is a time varying rate, you would pay a lower price per kilowatt hour if you're charging your car at certain times, usually at night. And that is really a win-win-win. It is good for you if you drive an electric vehicle because it lowers your fuel costs. It's good for the grid because we are shifting demand from moments where everybody's using electricity to moments where demand is lower, which keeps costs down. And it's even a win for people who don't drive electric vehicles because by using resources on the grid more efficiently, we're keeping electricity costs down for everybody. So this is a really key tool in the toolbox for incentivizing electric mobility that we want to make sure isn't overlooked in Rhode Island, because it is not a subsidy, it's just an accurate reflection of real-time costs. So it's a powerful and self-sustaining tool to help incentivize the switch to electric vehicles that we think should be included in the final plan. And then finally, we support EC4's call to focus as well on reducing fuel consumption in the first place. So we are urging them to fully implement the Transit Master Plan and the Bicycle Mobility Plan. These came out a couple years ago, and we're including the links if you want to take a look. But earlier this year, we were one of 36 organizations signing on to a letter about how to take the investments and the ideas that are in those plans and really strengthen them and make sure that they are implemented in a way that everybody benefits. So we'll include links both to the plans and that letter, and that both those links are what we sent to EC4 as well. So with that, we can move on from transportation and head back to Amanda for the thermal sector.
All right, next slide, please. So getting into EC4's priority actions in the thermal sector. We think that it's definitely a step in the right direction, but they need to be stronger if we're going to meet our Act on Climate mandates. EC4, similarly to how they tackled transportation, found two primary ways to reduce emissions in the thermal sector. And the first way is strategic electrification. They plan to target 15% penetration of energy efficient electric heating by 2030, which we support but don't feel is sufficient enough if we want to meet our Act on Climate mandates. By comparison, Massachusetts equivalent greenhouse gas reduction plan is targeting 37% penetration of heat pumps. So we definitely feel like we need to be stronger there. They also plan to pursue district geothermal, as well as incentivize efficient electric heating technologies, such as heat pumps. Next slide. Their second primary way to reduce emissions from the thermal sector is to use decarbonized fuels. And their first priority action under that is to increase biofuel blending with heating oil. We will be following this very closely to make sure that the science is right here and that it does result in greenhouse gas reduction. We'll also be following where the source of that biofuel is coming from, as that impacts its emissions footprint. Another priority action for them is to continue to abandon leak-prone gas pipes and pursue non-pipe alternatives. They also listed pursuing hydrogen demonstration projects as a priority action. But we want to be clear that that was only listed for hard to electrify areas. So we were happy to see that there was no mention of mixing hydrogen in with natural gas for heating. And we recently wrote a blog on how hydrogen and renewable natural gas are not the answer to home heating, which I will have Larry put in the chat for you all. And then another priority action is to consider the future of the gas distribution system, which we feel we have to gradually disinvest from and start to invest in heating electrification instead. And then lastly was to begin developing a renewable thermal standard. Next slide. All right, so moving on to our comments, we would like to see the Renewable Thermal Standard, or what we call a Clean Heat Standard, developed in 2023 for implementation in 2024. These standards encourage a transition to no or low emission heating, and they do this by obligating fuel suppliers to either earn or purchase an increasing number of clean heat credits each year. And those credits can be earned by installing heat pumps, insulating homes, building to passive house standards, things like that. And this would really create a market for technologies and services that would result in low or zero emissions from heating. So we feel that implementing this policy will really drastically reduce our emissions in the heating sector. Next slide. Second, we would like to see an adoption of a statewide building performance standard. And this requires large buildings, so buildings over 20,000 square feet, to report their energy usage and emissions to the state, and then reduce those emissions over time according to a set of standards that will become gradually more stringent. These standards would apply to existing buildings as well as new buildings. And this is actually not a brand new idea. As you can see here on the right, there are currently 33 states and municipalities working on building performance standards, one of which is Boston, through what they call the Building Emissions Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance, or BERDO for short. And in Rhode Island, Representative Kislak actually introduced a bill last year called the Green Buildings Act, and that would implement a building performance standard, which she also intends to introduce again this year. So we'll definitely be advocating for that, as we see it as a great way to reduce emissions from large buildings. Next slide. And then our last recommendation is to update Rhode Island's Building Energy Code. Our current energy code in Rhode Island is several years behind leading states like California, Washington, and Vermont. As you see in this graphic, the dark green means that they've adopted the 2021 International Energy Conservation Code, and Rhode Island is in orange, which means that we still have the 2009 code. So we urge Rhode Island to adopt the 2021 code, as well as allow communities to adopt a local option stretch code. And that will allow cities and towns the ability to adopt a building code that can get us even closer to net zero emissions than the statewide code. And we also wanted to mention the Pacific Northwest Laboratory study on the cost effectiveness of the 2021 IECC in Rhode Island. They found that the 2021 IEC will not only result in energy efficient buildings, but also more affordable buildings to own and operate. So we really see it as a win-win policy for Rhode Island. Next slide. So with that, we would like to encourage you to take action. EC4 is accepting comments on their draft plan until December 2nd. So we encourage you to submit comments. You can submit them via the Act on Climate public comment form, which we will put a link for in the chat. And we also encourage you to see our blog titled Rhode Island 2022 Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Plan, where we provide you with a comment template as well as a link to our comments. Next slide. All right, I think now we can open it up for questions.
If I could just take 1 minute to remind folks that this is our 40th anniversary as an organization. Green Energy Consumers Alliance was founded in Boston in 1982. This is our 20th anniversary working in Rhode Island. We started as People's Power and Light, and then the two organizations in Massachusetts and Rhode Island merged together, and it's been great serving both states. And if you are so able, we would greatly appreciate it if you'd go to our website, greenenergyconsumers.org/donate. Two generous donors, very generous donors, have combined their resources. And if you give between now and New Year's Eve, they'll match your contributions up to a total of $15,000. And so you may know, you'll be hearing soon perhaps that Giving Tuesday is coming up. It's the first Tuesday after Thanksgiving, which usually kicks off the year-end drive for charitable contributions. And our organization is a charity. We're a nonprofit organization, duly authorized by the Federal Internal Revenue Service, and any contribution you could make would be greatly appreciated. Amanda and Anna and 16 other staff do great work running programs and advocacy, and we could use all the help we can get. We would actually like to expand and go deeper in the programs and advocacy. We're in a climate crisis, but thanks to the Federal Inflation Reduction Act, we have a chance. We've just got to lean in and get everything we can in order to make the transition to clean energy. Next slide. Our email addresses are on this slide. It's our first name at greenenergyconsumers.org. If it's about transportation, Anna would be your go-to person. If it's buildings or electricity, it would be Amanda, or feel free to email me as well. And then I think we are ready now to start fielding questions.
There are a couple that I have lined up.
Okay.
If you have not yet asked a question and have a question, please go ahead and write some in the chat. There's one on transportation that I will respond to real quick, and then we nicely have one on heating and one on the electricity sector, so that works well. The question in transportation is whether it is a request that we advocate for more funding for the Erica and Udowski e-bike subsidy. And thank you very much for putting that in the chat. That is definitely something that we care about. So for those of you who aren't aware, the state of Rhode Island recently opened a subsidy or a rebate program for electric bikes named after a well-known and well-loved climate activist in Rhode Island who passed away a couple of years ago. And this is something that we've actually advocated for. So when the state of Rhode Island issued its draft plan for the DRIVE program, which is the current incentive program for electric vehicles, we submitted comments on that, and I'm pretty sure wrote a blog post about it too. But our comments were basically, at the time, DRIVE had proposed to offer a rebate for electric vehicles and carve out a certain amount of the project funding or the program funding for used electric vehicles under a certain price. And we know the car market because of our Drive Green program, but we did some more research to look into specifically the availability of used electric vehicles at the price point that they proposed, and found that it's basically impossible to find a used electric vehicle at that price point. So our comments were, great, we're glad that you're supporting new electric vehicles and used electric vehicles, keep doing that. But right now, it's very hard to find a used electric vehicle that is cheap enough for people who are looking for a used car to really consider going electric. So please use some of those funds to support e-bikes as well, because e-bikes, which are bikes that have an electric battery that can assist you to go further and also make it up steep hills, are a really great option for lots of people and can cut down on vehicle miles traveled by replacing car trips. So that's something that we supported back then, and that's something we can definitely bring back into this conversation with the greenhouse gas reduction plan. So I hope I responded to that question. And then Amanda or Larry, whoever wants to take this one, there's one about whether the state can, through this plan, encourage municipalities to start phasing out gas appliances.
I'll start. Amanda, feel free to jump in. We would encourage that. That's a really good point. The plan could encourage that, but we probably need in Rhode Island would be legislation that would enable that. And so to the point, that has been debated in California, and some cities and towns in California are now saying that cities and towns can ban new natural gas hookups. That's been debated in Massachusetts, and in the 2022 Massachusetts climate bill, the legislature authorized 10 cities and towns to apply to the state for permission to ban natural gas or fossil fuel hookups. We support that. We think it's a great step forward. Another approach that we would encourage for the state of Rhode Island is a building code that's a stretch code, as it's called, which is to update the statewide code for energy, but then authorize some cities and towns to go all electric for new construction and substantial renovation. And here's the theory, which is, Rhode Island is going to be a star by being the first in the country to have all of its electricity from renewable energy resources. By 2033, the electricity that in your home and business is going to be renewable. So that's easy to understand, right? And that we can add wind and solar, and those will displace fossil fuels on the grid. And we can get there by 2033, and then we're home free all the way forever. And as we switch people to electric cars by 2035, that's that California plan that Anna talked about, you can see that by 2050, most cars will be, almost all the cars on the road will be electric, powered by that clean electricity I just mentioned. We could have better public transportation that gets people out of cars. We can have biking and walking that further helps in those areas. So you can see that by 2050, transportation emissions would be getting close to zero. But with buildings, if you build a new building in Rhode Island in 2023, that's going to be standing for a long time, right? Maybe 100 years. And that could be burning fossil fuels. And so it makes it impossible to achieve zero by 2050. So we think that there ought to be a tool that allows cities and towns to have all electric requirements. Amanda, did I forget something?
Well.
Next questions, I guess, Anna?
There is a long one that I will try and summarize. So the question is, looks like clean energy production is going to be growing rapidly. That's great. But to support this trend and ensure future grid stabilization, what efforts are underway to incentivize and accelerate the deployment of energy storage technologies, both at the residential and grid level?
Yeah, that's a couple of years ago, the state of Rhode Island had a group called the Brattle Group do a study about what's it look like to get to 100% renewable energy by 2030 or 2033. And obviously, if we're going to have lots of wind and solar, we need to have storage. The question is spot on. And so we need to build that in gradually. The state of Rhode Island does need to create a strong program in that area. What we're waiting for, Rhode Island Energy is going to come out in about a month with a grid modernization plan. And we intend on intervening. That plan will go to the Public Utilities Commission for approval. We're going to study it quite a bit. We think that it will enable, we're hoping that it'll enable more storage at the utility scale and also at the building scale, residential and commercial. The great news is the Inflation Reduction Act has strong incentives for building storage capacity. And so the economics of that have greatly improved as a result of the federal law. So we do need that. The question continues, the person asked, will there be time of day pricing? And yes, according to the plan that's going to come out from Rhode Island Energy, it's very likely that there would be time of use pricing coming. What we need to utilize to get the full benefit of time of use pricing are advanced meters that can track your consumption essentially by the minute. Right now, whether you are, regardless of what time of day you use electricity, you're going to pay the same flat rate to Rhode Island Energy. And so it doesn't really encourage the wise use of when you can shift the load. And so with an electric car, for example, if we're going to all be driving electric cars, it's real easy to schedule that off peak. It's even very easy to schedule, your dishwasher and your clothes washer and your electric dryer and other devices. So we need that coming quickly.
I would just add that as far as incentivizing batteries in Rhode Island on both the residential and commercial scale, there is the Connected Solutions program, which allows you to get paid for dispatching your battery at times when the grid is stressed. So we're looking to, see that program expand as well as have more programs be brought online.
Good catch.
I want to acknowledge there was one more question. Sorry, I thought I was muted for a second. There was one question in the chat about how explicitly the draft plan looks at land use planning in the transportation sector, because the more that we can build our cities densely, the less far people have to travel, and that will reduce the amount of fuel that we need, whether it's electric or otherwise, to get around. I believe that was covered in the complete streets section about making it so that if you live somewhere, all of the needs that you might have are within a certain amount of walking or biking distance or public transit distance. But that's something that I will double check and include in the follow-up email, just to make sure we're giving you the most correct information about how the EC4 draft addresses that question. So look out for that in your email. I think that's it for questions, unless anyone has any burning questions that they are just now typing into the chat.
Yeah, we can give it a couple more minutes if you've thought about it. If you want to think some more, we'll give you a couple of minutes now, and then please feel free to email us afterwards if you'd like. I guess I'll just remind you. So here's the point. Massachusetts went through the same process that Rhode Island is doing right now, and which is developing a plan in order to comply with the global warming mandate. And so it's easy to overlook it because it's a plan. It's not a law by itself or whatever. It's not a regulation. But what's going to come after the plan, there will be laws and regulations that follow up on the recommendations. And so all we're saying here is you have an opportunity as a citizen to take a look at the plan, get a preview. This is essentially where the state is pointing. And if there's things you like about it or things you don't like about it, you have every right to make a comment. And so I put that into the chat if you're looking for the link on how to make your comments. And when after the plan is done and after we see the McKee administration try to implement aspects of it, or the legislature is acting, we will keep you posted. We'll continue to have blogs and webinars in order to keep you informed about opportunities going forward. Let's see, a couple more questions. One person asked, Anna, is it practical to let the marketplace cause enough EV adoption, or do we really need that California plan in order to get to where we want to be?
So glad somebody asked that question. So we've been, by way of answer, we've been running this Drive Green program since 2016. When we started, there were basically 4 electric vehicles on the market that made sense for most people, that were relatively affordable and had a relatively good range. And now the market looks like it is exploding. If you turn on TV, every manufacturer is running ads about their snazzy new electric vehicles, which is something that was not happening 3 years ago. And there's lots of news from all over the world about different manufacturers and countries setting timelines for the phase out of gas cars. So it is definitely tempting to feel like, oh, the market's going to take care of this. We don't have to worry. Transportation will sort itself out, and let's focus on the other sectors. But that transition will not happen fast enough or completely enough or equitably enough unless we keep pushing. So policies like the adoption of the California regulations are absolutely crucial to make sure that this is happening at a pace that will make sure that we can reach net zero by 2050. If we wait too long, as Larry mentioned, a vehicle that you purchase in 2035 will be on the road for 15 years. So if we don't have a plan to make sure that all the new cars that are being sold in 2035 are electric, we're going to be left with way too many gas-powered cars by 2050. And the other point is that we want to make sure that as many people as possible can access these vehicles, so that it's not just luxury electric cars going to only early adopters. We want to make sure everybody can benefit from the lower and stabler fuel costs and the lower maintenance costs. And so we really need to increase the number of new vehicles, new EVs that are sold, so that more used electric vehicles become available at reasonable prices. And a program like California's Advanced Clean Cars that gradually steps up the percentage of new cars that are electric is a great way to do that. We need a ton of supporting policies that we could do a whole other webinar about. But long story short, no, we can't wait. We can't assume the market's going to take care of it. We definitely have to keep pushing.
Here's another question was, is Rhode Island planning for the increase in electric demand that we're going to get as more people go to electric vehicles and to heat pumps to heat their homes and businesses? What are the estimates around the total percentage increase in electricity demand? I don't think this plan gets too deep into those numbers, but it's generally understood that it's certainly going to cause a steady increase in electricity demand. But by all the accounts I've seen, it should be manageable. It should be gradual enough to allow the electric grid to build the generation and to also update the poles and the wires and the transformers and the substations that are necessary. What we expect to see is that remember, each electric vehicle and heat pump that comes online is going to pay for its electricity. And in some places like California that have gotten ahead of us, they're actually seeing that electric vehicles are paying more into the system than they're causing additional cost. And so it's been fairly easy in California to justify their investment in electric vehicles. So we would expect to see that in Rhode Island as well. I do know from seeing a presentation from Rhode Island Energy that they are anticipating a substantial increase in demand, and they're pretty confident that if we plan for it correctly, that they'll be able to make the upgrades necessary. And that's where they refer a lot to demand response as being something that we want to see, or in time of use pricing, so that we can shift loads that when we can, from a peak period to an off-peak period, and that will save Rhode Islanders a ton of money and also just make for a more resilient grid. And so when they come out with their grid modernization plan, I think we'll get more details on that. I think the idea is the Public Utilities Commission has to review all that and try to make sense of it and make sure that if we're going to have electric vehicles, heat pumps, we need to modernize the grid in an appropriate way. And so we want to have Rhode Island Energy be a partner in this transition, but we also want to make sure that they spend in the right places with ratepayer dollars to upgrade the grid. Here's a fun fact that in New England, the state of Rhode Island included, has what's called a summer peak. The highest use of the year is typically in July and August in Rhode Island. And it's going to be that way for another 10 or 15 years. But around 2035, if we adopt heat pumps as we need to, we're going to shift to a winter peak period. And so that will be an important thing to contend with at that time. We end up having sort of a butterfly shape where the winter and the summer will have much higher usage than the spring and the fall. And here's a fun point, which is in the winter, when we've got those heat pumps cranking to keep us warm, the offshore wind is going to be cranking, and that's when it's going to produce a lot of power. Winter output from a wind farm is much, much greater than any other time of year. So that's part of the solution. We could put it all together, connect the dots. That's how we get through managing the peak period. Anna or Amanda, there's a question, there's a person here who is a constituent of Senator DeMario, and she wanted to know more about that bill. Representative Cortriand is also attending here today, and we're glad to have Representative Cortriand. They're co-sponsoring the bills that we're looking at. Do you want to talk about that, Anna or Amanda?
I'll let Amanda take that.
Sure. So it's actually what was the Electric Transportation Act last year. We're taking the main piece of that, which is adopting California's emission standards and making that a main bill this year. But we don't have, obviously, a bill number or anything like that yet, but we'll definitely keep you updated on that.
Look out for an invitation to an entire webinar focused just on that sometime in the coming months. I think that there's a question that I might suggest we end on, which is for someone who's just learning about all this, there's one action to take here, which is right to submit comments on this, but what other actions can people take? And I know Larry responded in the chat, but I wanted to say it out loud as well. We have tons of different ways that you can act, from switching out appliances that you're using in your daily life, whether that's an electric vehicle or going to a heat pump or opting for renewable energy. But if you subscribe to our blog, you'll be put on a list every time we have an action alert where you can reach out to a decision maker or write a letter to the editor or whatever it is. We'll make sure to keep you posted there. So if you haven't subscribed to our blog, we would recommend that you do that. And I'm sure, Larry, you have some more thoughts on this too.
No, that's excellent, folks. We're happy to have your participation today. But you know, the climate crisis is not a spectator sport, so we hope to be a resource for you. We'll accept all support from people who want to make a difference here in any way you can.
And with that, I think we'll end this webinar.
Yes, watch your email. We'll send you some follow-up information.
Thanks all.
Happy Thanksgiving.